Thank you, Andrew and Kofi, for being here, and thank you to everyone in the room for joining us for this conversation. I want to start with news that is literally less than a day old. So it was in the media today that Facebook has essentially decided to maintain their current policies around political advertising. And if we think about the really large social media companies, if we think in particular about Twitter, Google, and Facebook, they have taken somewhat different approaches, ranging from Twitter's position that they're not going to have political advertising, to Google's that it's sort of in the middle, to Facebook taking much more of a hands-off policy. This is a complex question, and I'm just interested in each of your reflections on whether you think one or another of these positions is the right one to take.
So this is the easy question of the night, right?
Right.
It's getting,
right.
This is getting harder from here.
Please.
Yeah, I think I'm disappointed by him taking this stance. I think that there's a clear misuse in the way that political ads were used in the last election by parties, and I think it really needs further study whether one should be able to target so specifically using, let's see, what is that called? It's a customer. What's that again? Right?
Custom audience.
Custom audience. Thank you. It's not custom account. So this custom audience where you can really super slice and dice, and you can use many different pieces of information to really get at a very specific group of people, maybe as small as 20, and give a particular ad to those people that isn't really vetted by anybody. It just sort of goes out, and these are not messages that necessarily say I approve this message, and so the lack of transparency there, I think, is of great concern, and it's this custom audiences was built to have advertisers be able to target people that they want to sell their products to, and in that setting, it's very innocuous. But what happens when you take something that's that well crafted and use it for potentially, problematic purposes?
Kofi? Now you don't work for them anymore now, right?
I do not. And even when I did, I don't necessarily bite my tongue. So I think the short answer is that I think it's probably the wrong position, but I actually think the longer answer is that it's a very nuanced question. So I think the reason Facebook wants to have a hard hands-off approach is that it's not that clear that it's easy to define what a political ad is. So Facebook's point of view is the way that people win elections is by having access to fans, by having access to voice, by giving politicians that may never have had an opportunity to build an audience, a way to build an audience. It levels the playing field. If you think back to 20 years ago, everyone needed to be able to run a TV campaign to win an election. So on the one hand, we have friends who've won local elections, who are great politicians who've used the platform to great effect. But there are people you would never have heard of before and had no profile. So do we think about taking that away from everyone? And then the other argument would be, if Greta Thunberg runs an ad about climate change, is that a political ad? When we think about Barack Obama, who really was the first social media president who used Facebook to great effect, do we still want those types of outcomes? So I think, personally, I'd say that my answer is I think we should get rid of political advertising, but I do think it's a very complex and nuanced question.
And it gets at an even larger question about whether having a kind of unmediated access to a very large media voice is a good or a bad thing.
Right.
And this seems to me to be sitting right at the center of a lot of our debates about social media. So I think Mark Zuckerberg might have said today that he thinks about the voices of individuals on Facebook as what he called the fifth estate. We've always described the press as the fourth estate. We have the three branches of government, we have the press. And the argument in favor of unmediated social media is that now you are giving a large-scale voice to individuals
Correct.
that is not filtered through
Correct.
either the government or the traditional media.
Correct.
But it does beg the question, is that a good or a bad thing? That is some filtering, at the end of the day, a good or a bad thing?
I think it depends which side of that question you sit on. If you're the person who doesn't have access, if you're the person who's been kept out by gatekeepers, if you're the person whose position to things is mediated, you would certainly prefer less filtering. Because the reality is that like there are many places around the world, frankly, including this one, which looks more and more like other places around the world, where governments do not provide access and do filter the voice. So I think, you know, the argument of sort of freedom of speech and freedom of voice writ large, you kind of either have to believe fully in that argument, that like more voice is a good thing, which clearly is Mark's perspective. And then the counter argument is like, but there's a certain set of people that we don't want to give innumerable voice. And that really comes down to like content moderation and what are your standards around who's allowed to speak, when they're allowed to speak, and what they're allowed to say in these communities.
So give me an example of something that Facebook would not allow to be on Facebook.
Oh, that's a good question. Wow, that content policy is long. Let's see. I think there's like very clear things around hate speech. So if you use a racial epithet on Facebook and it gets flagged, you're gonna get banned. Even around misinformation, if there's things that are obviously false, like fake news articles, those will get flagged and they'll get taken down.
Even if you're the president of the United States?
So this is what's hard. So Facebook's position, again, which reasonable people can disagree with, I do, is that what Trump does is news. And so there's some value at writ large that like if the president of the United States wants to say things to the country, why should they be the people to block it? And by the way, Twitter, which is the way Trump communicates, also has the same, because it is newsworthy. The president wants to have an address, it's newsworthy.
Right.
Yeah.
So Kate mentioned the Arab Spring in her introduction. Let's go back a decade or so. In the early part of the 2010s, there was a tremendous amount of positive enthusiasm around the potential for social media to spread and create democracy, precisely because it was giving all these voices to individuals who would not otherwise have had a voice. What did we miss when we were thinking about social media at that time? Because clearly it's evolved in a much more complicated way.
Correct.
What did we not see a decade ago that we might be able to see now?
Well, I think one thing is that it sort of burst upon the scene, or this new use of a communication method that took people by surprise, just in watching how it contagiously sort of flooded the world. And so there's a novelty to it, and I think people got caught up on the novelty of that spreading as opposed to some of the hard work that went in behind that spreading, and that this is something that people there have been working on in different ways for a number of years. And yes, we had this sudden moment. The flip side of it is also that once that technique has been revealed, then any side can use it. And we certainly have instances where those kinds of techniques have been used for things that perhaps we wouldn't support, that we look at that and said, oh, this is great. This actually aligns with the way that Mark Zuckerberg thinks of Facebook being, that things are more connected and open and then good things will happen. But those same kind of rapid spreading of things that are getting amplified can also be used in places like Myanmar or Azerbaijan, and to support things that perhaps we're less comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we missed this is an incredible utility. It's sort of social movement at a pace and at a virality that we had never seen before. And so seeing those first use cases, everyone was like, this thing is incredible. No one thought about the other ways that it could be used. And I also think that for all of the platforms, the general philosophy was to be very hands-off. So Mark's view of Facebook was that this, and same with Twitter's view, same with Google's view, was that these things were utilities and actually didn't have a moral obligation or responsibility. It was a tool that was being provided for people to use and for people to express their voice. I think what we missed at the time was that had to come with very explicit sense of responsibility around how those tools were going to be used, which was not how they were built initially.
And so as one of the ways they function as tools is by collecting an enormous amount of data.
Correct.
I was at a meeting in New York at which a computer scientist spoke, and he essentially described these large social media organizations as surveillance organizations. And so have we collectively, have the companies, have we as a society thought carefully about how to manage this unprecedented wave of information about every single one of us? I mean, every one of us, even Luddites like me, see this. If I go onto Amazon and I search for earphones, for noise-canceling earphones, the next day I'll go onto a completely different website and an ad for noise-canceling headphones will pop up.
Retargeting, it's magic.
Yeah. And so how concerned should we be about this enormous amount of data that is being collected about every one of us, and then about the uses to which it's put, to whom who is it sold to, and what do they do with that information? I'm curious, is this something that you talk to your students about as you teach them how to think about and manage data?
So I haven't talked about this with the students in my class. The class I teach on this is network science, which is much more about the structure of the networks themselves, and we've spent less time talking about sort of the surveillance aspects of things. There are professors in my department who do classes that are more focused on internet as an entity. But it certainly is something that we should be thinking and talking about, and sort of, I think, pushing for sort of user rights in a way that we click these boxes that opt us into things that we don't actually realizing we're being opted into. And I think it will take. We've had a few flare-ups around how data has been used that people have been uncomfortable with. The Cambridge Analytica one is probably the biggest one recently, but there was also a study where that Facebook put together. This is actually a fairly mild study, in my opinion, about how they sort of shifted people's feeds a little bit and watched if I repressed a few happy stories or repressed a few sad stories, whether that had an impact, a sort of an emotional contagion, and it had some effect, and they reported on it, and people were sort of outraged by this, and part of it, the academic community, because that would not have passed muster over an IRB, sort of internal review board. But not having worked here, I'm like, oh yeah, this happens all the time. This is what software engineering is. You tweak some things, see if it makes a change, see if it's better. Like, you're constantly doing stuff like this, and it just happened to appear in a place into an audience that said that this did not do some things that we normally do, and this concerns us. So I think there needs to be sort of more of an it's going to have to come from, I don't want to actually call it protest, but requests from people about their data rights.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I agree with everything you just said, and there's actually some really interesting ideas out in the world at the moment about actually paying consumers for their data and what that would look like, and sort of a digital dividend. And Andrew Yang has got some policies that he's been talking about. There's a bunch of interesting thinking in this space about how do you start to compensate people for their data, which I think takes away like some of the angst around this conversation. I think what's happened up until this point is we've all been actually perfectly happy. I certainly know, like, I can't figure out how to get out of this room into the main street without Google Maps. So I'm good, like, I'll use it. Mm-hmm. But like, this is the trade-off I understand.
I've noticed that it doesn't work very well in this city. It always seems to put you on the wrong street.
Well, did you buy those headphones?
Yeah. Not yet.
No, well, there you go.
But I think we've chosen to make a trade-off that we didn't fully understand. So I think, to your point, everyone opted into these things not fully understanding how the information is going to be used, or if it's being used for purposes of advertising or whatever the case might be. I think people are much, much more clear about that trade-off, and I think that's prompting a very different type of conversation, and frankly, a very different type of conversation with ourselves about how we think about our data and how our data is being used. So, all the platforms are seeing people spend a lot more time thinking about their privacy settings or taking action, but the reality as well is like people are also inherently lazy. So you do these privacy checkups once a year, but then like, are you going to do it again, and are you going to stay vigilant? And I think we have to figure out how do we, as consumers or people who use these services and who benefit from them, but how do we stay vigilant about how our data is used on the back end?
Have these, typically in this country, when we've developed a new utility that is seen as central to the functioning of society, we get into the question of regulating it.
Correct.
What role should the government play? We've done it with television. We've done it with telephones. We do it with radio. Should the government? It's scary to think about.
It's coming.
But should the government begin to look at this enormous and powerful utility and say, all right, we need to start to establish some ground rules?
The easy answer is yes. The other answer is that the government has no clue. So I don't know anyone who's watched any of these hearings. Like, for real, it's terrifying. If you watch any of these hearings and you hear the questions that are being asked, you're just like, what are we doing here? Like, why are these people even engaging in this conversation that they know nothing about?
Well, it's because the average age of a senator is 18.
Correct. So I think the obvious answer is that absolutely the government should be involved in thinking about how this industry and these platforms evolve. I think, and by the way, I think all the platforms understand that and are ready for it. And 3 years ago, it was very clear that this was going to happen. So the conversation went from like, we don't want to be regulated to like, how do we actually partner and do this in a responsible way and figure out what that legislation and regulation needs to look like. But it's not clear to me, at least based on what I've seen from the government so far, that there are great ideas about how to do this. Because even if you think about some of the plans that some of the candidates have espoused, like Warren's plan to break them up, it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't solve any of the problems that are actually the problems that need to be solved. So it's solving a different issue, but it's not the problems we're talking about in this room. All of them get harder to solve if you break up those companies.
Right.
And certainly I think people use these as if they are utilities. It's getting baked into their lives, and that's not only Facebook, it's things like Google. And I think that sort of perspective sort of informs what sort of relationship you should be having with the government, perhaps in talking about regulation and looking at this as a public good. And again, I'm not an economist. I'm with Kofi on. I'm not really sure where this goes, but this is also about the time that people started looking at Microsoft and its trajectory, right? It's been about 20 years or so. So I think it's sort of a natural evolution as companies grow large, that we should be taking stock and looking at, okay, where have we come and what's supposed to come next? And
that was much simpler. That was clear antitrust. Yeah. That's a very straightforward thing to fix.
Right.
These are like much more complex issues where it's not clear what the right regulation is. So for instance, if we decided as a society that the government could ban all political advertising in the United States, that's probably within the government's remit to do. If that happens, there's like downstream effects on the ability of candidates of any type to raise funds. There's downstream effects on ability of any social causes to be able to get a profile. Last year, we lost a friend of a friend to police brutality, and I went on Facebook and I said I want to raise money for the Equal Justice Initiative, which is Brian Stevenson's thing, and I raised $12,000 on Facebook just from like friends and friends of friends in a matter of 4 or 5 days.
Right, and is that political?
Is that political?
Right.
So I think these are the things that we would have to think about further down the line and figure out what the right regulation is.
Yeah, and I will say that like banning political ads isn't the only option. There's regulating them is probably a much more reasonable way to go, and that could be things like spending caps and transparency about what ads you've put out there, so that anybody could go and audit things that are basically, the process is very opaque right now. And that, I think, is concerning, that people are getting expert advice about how to target their ads, potentially in a way that affects the electorate and the government, how we rule our country.
Right.
And I think so I think that the public deserves transparency around that process so they can be informed.
I want to shift direction a little bit and talk about something else that Kate alluded to in her opening remarks, and that is that this is essentially the first generation of children that has been raised with social media as a daily part of their lives. And in some ways, the students, I mean, you're both parents, in addition to being people who work in this area, children of different ages. I often talk about the students who are arriving at Macalester right now, the 18-year-olds, the 20-year-olds, as sort of the first generation for whom this has just been a part of their lives for pretty much as long as they can remember. What excites you and what worries you as parents, and in your case as a faculty member who works with young people, about how they are being affected by living in a world of social media?
So I'll start with personal stories, just as you open that up. I think overall having access to the internet and wide groups of people to talk to has been really great for my two daughters, that they've been able to find groups online of people with shared interests, that they start off either drawing pictures and exchanging them, or being interested in a certain series, and then those ends up becoming friendships as they evolve. And so, and in particular, in sort of the middle school years, where many parents know things start to kind of fall apart for various different reasons, and that these communities that they had developed were incredibly supportive, especially as they started to express themselves in maybe ways that were less traditional than other kids, and having that support system is really, really remarkable.
Yeah, so I tend to think, again, I think when we think about our kids, sometimes this feels like super far away, but we also know it's going to be here tomorrow, because now they're watching Paw Patrol on YouTube or whatever. It's pretty benign. But yeah, I think we've certainly seen, to your point, we've seen this have both effects. Again, with all of this stuff, we've seen teens find real community on YouTube, especially, again, if you on Facebook. If you always think about this through the lens of leveling the playing field, through the lens of providing access to people that don't have it, through the lens of giving voice to people on the margins, social networks are amazing for that. And actually, the use case of groups, if you're not in a Facebook group of some kind, Facebook groups are probably the best part of Facebook, because these are controlled communities where everyone who's there is opted in for the conversation that's being had. So that could be, are you a transgender teen and you're finding other people that look like you? Do you have a very specific anxiety that you want to share with the world? Is there something, are your parents getting divorced, and that a conversation you need to have with other people? There's loads of this that you see on all the platforms. There's people finding this really rich, meaningful communities that help them navigate whatever they're dealing with. I think on the downside, we certainly see, elements of social comparison, elements of feeling having to act out your life on the world stage and having to put out a performance. So Instagram just did something recently that I thought was super interesting, which is they've taken away the like count. So on Instagram right now, if you go on Instagram and you look at any post, you actually can't tell how many people have liked it, which is a really interesting idea, because you know that like counts are driving dopamine hits and getting people to re-engage with the platform. They've made the decision to move away from that. I have no idea how it's working out or what it means, but I think it's interesting that they're taking the step to say, actually, we don't think that's the right way to think about your social experience. We want this to make it feel much more organic. And I think in general, Facebook went through a evolution of thinking about engagement as sort of time spent, and so counting the amount of time people spent on, and have pivoted very much to a way of thinking about time well spent. So much more qualitative, much more focused on connections between people and their friends and their communities versus public content. So I think all of the platforms are starting to wrestle with that there's a well-being element to using this, and we have to be really deliberate about how we manage that.
One of the things that you'll hear from pretty much any college president now, and I think even from a majority of college faculty, is if they're asked, what is the thing you worry most about? What is the thing that's changed most over the last decade? It's the level of depression and anxiety among this generation of students. I think about it every day. Faculty who have never had to confront this before find themselves acting as not just professors but counselors. Has social media played a role in that?
Oof.
So there's obviously a correlation. Both these things have come together, and there's all sorts of studies that note that correlation. I think there are some recent studies that would say yes, there is a causation effect. So a recent one from 2018, I think, this was a study they ran with 150 students or so at a college, and they limited one group to, obviously they weren't cruel. They said, I think it was like 30 minutes a day or 30 minutes a week. It wasn't and that was across 3 apps. So you could do like 10 minutes in Instagram and 10 minutes in Facebook, and I forget what the last one was. And then there was the control group, and the control group, they just had a discussion about managing your time online. And when the study ended, the group that had cut back their social media showed improved mental health. They were immeasurably happier, and interestingly, the other group also improved, not as much, but just the fact that they were thinking about being conscious about managing their time, they also improved a bit. And so I find that particular study compelling. I think, but you can't forget that time spent online can actually be incredibly therapeutic.
Correct.
And so there are other studies of people who who are introverts or have social anxiety, and spending time on online media it helps them. Up to a point, you can do it too much, and particularly for those with, I think, social anxiety, there's a certain point at which you start to then rely on it too much, and you get to the fatigue stage of it, and then you end up even more depressed. So it's not a replacement, but it is a tool in your kit, and so a very valuable one.
Yeah, I think the thing, Facebook clearly has done a lot of research on this particular topic of sort of mental well-being, and I was alluding to this earlier, but I think the thing that they discovered was that it wasn't just a question of like how much, it was like what you were actually doing with the time. So the quality of the activity you were engaged in very much was the determinant of like whether this was like a depressing session or something that was going to affect you negatively. So if you were on there and you were, Kate uses Facebook to organize and like drum up support for causes that she cares about and galvanize people to go to rallies. Like if that's how you're using it, it's amazing. If you're using it in groups to connect with people that are like-minded around things that you care about, it's amazing. If you're sitting there scrolling through content and just looking at stuff and not engaging, it's not good. So I think it's about figuring out the different types of use cases, and we've seen that depending what people are doing, that very much is a determinant of how positive their experience is.
So should we be teaching children that when they're in first grade, third grade, fifth grade? Should that be part of what we are teaching children now?
I would argue absolutely that we should be thinking about how do we help people, and this was something that we actually had to think about a lot when I worked on Internet.org, which was my first job at Facebook, because then it wasn't about children, but it was like you're introducing people net new to this technology. So what are the sets of rules and behaviors that you want them to be aware of? And like we spend a lot of time on things like fraud and like when you friend people and if someone asks you for money, like all these things that happen on the internet, but I don't think we spent enough time on like well-being and how should you engage with this and which things are going to feel more productive for you.
Right, and that sort of comes down to ethical design a bit, like making the interface reward behaviors that are actually good for you
Correct.
and your well-being, which is different ways to measure success, not just engagement, this is already,
correct.
Kofi's already been sort of talking about that. So it's not only on, us correcting or modeling good behavior or talking about it, but also I think there's
Changing
opportunities
the system.
to develop apps that have that aspect in mind.
Yeah, and the Facebook actually did this when they went through this discovery process. They created a new metric, which was like meaningful social interactions, which then became the thing that the system was optimizing for. Now, what that did is it brought up all of your friends and family and close connections up in your feed, versus like farther away connections, and then it deprioritized public content. So if you were an advertiser, you were not happy with this change because it impacted your ability to reach people with advertising, but it was better for people. So those are the types of trade-offs. Like that was a direct revenue hit on the business because there was less ad space, but the choice was the right thing to do.
So I can't conclude the discussion part of this without beating the McAllister drum at least one time. So some of you may know this, some of you may not, but over the last 5 or 6 years, the number of McAllister students studying in Andrew's department has exploded. In a typical fall right now at McAllister, half of the students on campus will take a class in one department, math, statistics, and computer science. And the number of computer science majors, applied mathematics majors has grown at McAllister as it has across the country. So each of you, just tell me why we should want McAllister students to be the ones who are becoming fluent in these technologies so that they will go out and be the next generation of people who do develop apps and algorithms. Why? I believe that's a good thing.
Yep.
And I'm interested in your take on that.
I think it's an extraordinary thing. I think in general we're seeing across tech that the liberal arts as a foundation is becoming more important. I mean, all of these companies were initially built just on engineers and product managers, just building things, testing them, getting them out in the world, but not really with the broad sense about humanity, not really thinking about the long-term impacts of their decisions, not really thinking about knock-on effects and impacts on underprivileged groups. And I think sort of issues of like justice, of equity, of really thinking holistically, these are the things that we get from the liberal arts, and thinking about ethics and ethical design. Like these are the conversations that we always had at McAllister, and that's always been very central to that. So I think having that mindset in this world, thinking about design that way, has huge opportunities.
And yeah, I completely agree with that. I'll start in a different direction and then join Kofi. That I look at the students who are coming in now, and because of the context they grew up in, computers have been just a general part of their life, and they don't necessarily see computing or computing skills as being distinct from the other things that they want to do in a way that even 15 years ago, there would be people who would very, very, very hands-off if you wanted them to do just a little bit of coding. But now, if you want to be an English major, why wouldn't you want to try to take these coding skills and use that to do some sort of deep reading, deep analysis? These are tools at your disposal that weren't there before, and it basically gives you another way to engage with a corpus. And so we see that a lot, just from students, just genuinely just knowing that they should have some fluency in this way of thinking. And another part is building on what Kofi was saying, is that not only are students coming in with these multiple frames that they can use, we as a department actually leverage that as well. Like, we know that our students are hungry for this sort of thing, and we also see it as our obligation to train them to think about things and not just like teach them how to how to write, code that will compile. We teach a lot about communication. We teach a lot about ethics. And I think there's actually, there's at least one or two people in the audience of students while they were at Macalester who made a huge impact while they were there, and we really called on their expertise. We do lots of small group work where people have to work together, and those groups are often randomly created, and we were seeing a pattern of sort of males dominating these, all the typical things you might see happening in these dynamics in these groups, and the students developed a workshop, and we basically changed, we sort of did a seismic shift in the way people work in our classes, and it was incredibly well attended. Maybe 80 students showed up, and we had a big sort of opening thing, and then split into small groups and talked about it, and there was a huge difference in terms of what was happening in the classroom after that, and that's persisted once we built that culture into our classrooms, and also into the class materials as well. That we have assignments that talk about doing that instead of like playing Star Wars. This is, and so by the time somebody gets through our program, they are thinking about how there's multiple contexts. There's not just one right answer, and that the right answer can change radically if you just have a slight shift in perspective, and not being threatened by that, being ready to engage in a conversation.
Well, first, join me in thanking Kofi and Andrew. We are now going to open it up for some questions. We have 2 microphones.
I'm Gretchen, class of 96. This is less a question and more just something I'm chewing on, and maybe you all will hear a question in it. But my work is as an academic life coach for stressed out students. And so attention management is a big thing we talk about. And so I was thinking about that when you asked about well-being and depression and anxiety. I'm seeing that in my work. I go to conferences for college learning centers. Everyone is really worried. And one of the things that I notice, I also train educators, and I notice that a lot of educators talk to students as if the problem is happening to them. But I know I struggle with my own attention management. And I think this is a question where we can all be on the same page. And I'm curious, so maybe, okay, I'm curious about something. Here's the question. I'm wondering if there are, or could there be on, say, Macalester campus, conversations that level the playing field with students and faculty and staff members, where everyone's talking about how do we handle this with our daily choices. An example that I've come up with, I am so much of a happier person because I've put a feed eradicator onto my Facebook, so I'm not allowed to scroll anymore. It is impossible for me to do so. And so I'm using it to be more active. So I'm self-employed, so I have a couple Facebook groups. I also need Facebook ads. And I love using Facebook now simply because I don't have that passive scrolling. However, also how many of you watch Netflix? Oh my God, I probably spend 2 hours a day passively consuming Netflix and YouTube, seriously, as a self-employed person at home. So that's an attention management problem that I don't have a solution for. And I just think we all need to be talking about this in our personal lives. So thoughts?
Sure. I think, when I think about my role as a professor compared to, the professors who taught me in the late 80s and early 90s, there was this really, really big gap between them and me. Like, they were gods to me. And my first day at Macalester, it was like some day in August. The school hadn't started yet, and there's my chair, and the student walked up, and she said, "Oh, Joseph, this is Andrew." And I was like, "Oh, I guess we go by our first name." I personally have been working at trying to be imperfect in front of my students and showing some of those things. I think certainly now I'm at this part of my career, I'm safer to perhaps show some of my own weaknesses, or I feel more safe. And so this is where, like, I would give a huge amount of credit to this one campus organization of students called Voices on Mental Health, who are making this a topic of discussion and creating spaces where people can talk about this. And it's a needed thing. We need to reduce the stigma. And then there's training for faculty by themselves. There have been some panels with staff and faculty, including myself, where we sort of come out to the campus with our own struggles with depression and anxiety and what that looks like for us. So these things are happening. I feel like I'm making it up as I go along, and certainly the first time that I said that out loud to a class of students was absolutely terrifying. But I did in the context of we had lost a student on campus, and I just felt really inauthentic at that moment for me to do anything except be honest with them. But that sort of started me on a path, and I know that there are others like me, and others, some amazing staff members, both in the Health and Wellness Center and at some of the supporting centers, just disability services, who are working really hard to do the kinds of things you're talking about and much more.
Yeah, I think I love your idea about actually also just sharing like a practical hack, right? Because you could actually see, like, I know McAllister's doing hackathons. Like, you could build an experience around this that gets everyone in the college to engage on that problem, which is how do we manage our attention? Because all of us have little things that we do. Like, I turn off notifications, for hours, and that helps me because I'm like, if I see the notification, I'm going to click on it. Like, so that's how I manage it. But everyone has little tricks. So how do we start to share those and like create a space where people can access like each other's techniques for managing?
My name is Yan. I graduated in 2012. So what I'm doing is kind of linked with both speakers. I graduated from Mac with a math major, and I took Professor Beveridge's class as well. So what I'm doing right now is data scientist at the Bay Area, and I'm analyzing marketing. Yep. So I'm actually on the demander side of the social media. So I love data, love social media data. Yeah. So it helps us be able to target at the right audience, especially given our company has a very niche audience. So we're able to target at the right age of audience, right group of audience, instead of wasting or burning our marketing budget. So of course there's lots of like more and more regulations and understanding the privacy policy and restricting the data. So I actually want to hear both of your thoughts regarding, especially Kofi, your thought regarding being at a marketer at Doordash, like as a demander or being benefited from this situation. How do you think about it?
Sure. Look, I think if you step away from the conversation we've been having and you think about what you're asking, which is social media an effective tool for marketers? I think it's undoubtedly probably the greatest tool marketers have had access to in a generation. I mean, the thing that's always been the holy grail of marketing is like personalized marketing at scale. We all know like one-to-one marketing works the best, but you can never scale it to 1 million people. Social media allows you to do that, right? So I think it certainly unlocked a ton of growth, whether that's for Facebook or DoorDash or any of the companies that we all work for. And so for me, I think as a tool, it's just more how do you make sure that like your use of it is responsible as with anything else, right? So how do you think about the sets of like, we've had issues with brands using targeting to exclude people from experiences like targeting African Americans about not getting housing. So like, how do you actually design the systems on the platform side to make sure that like these are actually equitable tools? And then as the practitioner, how do you use them in like the appropriate way? But I think there's no question that this has created an entire new ability to do things that we could never do before. Like I can work out how to, target someone in Redwood City that I know ate at a Chick-fil-A in Atlanta to say there's now a Chick-fil-A in Redwood City. Like, that's kind of crazy. Probably shouldn't be able to do that. But I think, again, in this particular instance, it's not nefarious, and it's like you're a hand raiser. We know you're interested in this, so now we're telling you we have it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as with any sort of tech innovation, there's always ethics that come hand in hand with that. The tool itself isn't necessarily good or evil. It's what you do with that tool. And I imagine I would love to have sort of an ethics review if I was at your company, where there's someone who wasn't part of the project. You just say, well, here's what we're doing, and they can just give you a second eye and to say, oh, you know what, did you think about how this might actually be sort of accidentally marginalizing some people you weren't thinking about? Yeah. So it's really that unintended exclusion, I think, in something like that. And then, of course, there are people who, are bad actors. Facebook is a space, and if you assume everybody is going to be great, then everything's wonderful, but it's not a utopia. It's a complete ecosystem that's just going to reflect the kinds of people. And unfortunately, it has people in it. So, right, that doesn't mean that, posting on Facebook is bad, that people who troll on Facebook are bad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's also, like we've seen, I did this project a couple of years ago with the African American AIDS Foundation. So HIV/AIDS has declined in every audience across the United States except the male African American community, right? And so this was like starting to say, how can we use a platform like Facebook to actually target ads, to give people information to go get tested at a neighborhood level? And that organization has all the hotspots where they know the crisis is deepest, and you could never have done that with any other medium. Like, you could literally go, I'm going to talk to the 400 people who live in these 3 blocks about this specific issue, and we sort of have like massive impact. So again, I think the ability to target is amazing and makes certainly the work much more effective.
Yeah, and even in I think very consistently through our stats courses now, we ask about all the data sets. Where did the data come from? What are you going to do with it? What are the impacts on people if we actually use these results? And that can be both positive and negative. And we ask students to think about that every time, even if it's a data set about 3 throws made, right? It's just to get them in the habit of every data set they look at. They should think about these 4 or 5 questions.
I guess I see social media as a collection of people in a like-minded space, and at times I also see McAllister that way, and I'm curious to see or to hear your thoughts on how you see McAllister as a collection of like-minded people, and where that hits diminishing marginal returns in the inability to see nuance. And I think it's less of a left versus right thing and more of a just kind of ability to understand differences and have an improved scope of a conversation, as opposed to just kind of a left and right way of thinking.
It's a great question. I always used to say that McAllister was the most tolerant place unless you were a Republican, and this was in 1997, and we had Republicans on campus who felt super marginalized at the time. I don't know if that's still true, but I do think that like all of us, just from a DNA perspective, gravitate to people that are like us. Like, we're social animals, and so like when you think about the conversations around social media and echo chambers and all this, the reality is that like most people, regardless of social media, have a truth in their head that they believe in, and nothing will change their minds, right? So like most of us, being exposed to new information does not change your mind. This is like a well-known psychological effect. So I think one of the things that is worth thinking about, whether it's for McAllister or social media or any of these types of conversations, like how do we open up and have the conversation differently? We were talking in the room earlier, and Katie was saying that she has a brother who she agrees with on everything, but the way he goes about it just pisses everyone off. So it's like, how do we get to the point where we are actually open to having a conversation versus trying to win an argument? I feel like much of like what I see online is people trying to win an argument. There's not like a genuine exchange of ideas. It's like, I have an idea, you have an idea, and like we're gonna keep screaming until the end of time. So I think, like, when I think about McAllister, again, I haven't been there in a long time, but I would hope that it's really still continues to be about an exchange of ideas. It continues to be a place where, like, everyone's voice can be heard regardless of what perspective you're bringing to the room. One of the things that I found really rewarding about McAllister is, like, we would sit in a classroom and talk about rogue states like Iran or North Korea or Syria, and there would always be someone in the room who'd say, yeah, but why do you get to call them a rogue state? Why do you get to have nuclear weapons and they don't? And so it's sort of this openness to actually having not a preconceived notion of what the world needs to look like, I think for me, was like the heart of the McAllister experience. So you both have to tell me whether that's still true.
Yeah, well,
I don't go there anymore.
I think the real meat of your question and the point at the heart of it is that the problems that we see in virtual spaces are not really different from the problems we see in actual spaces. What virtual spaces simply have the power to do is to amplify. And so whether you're existing in a virtual space or an actual space like a college campus, I think it is both our nature and also dangerous to exist in these echo chambers. And I will confess that if I could change one thing about McAllister, it would be that there was more willingness to let information change your ideas, because I've seen the same studies. We like to think that exposure to information will change your mind, but as Kofi said, there's a lot of evidence that just doesn't do it. You'll find the information you'll seek out the information that confirms your point of view. And the internet has made that even easier to do. You can filter out everything that doesn't confirm your point of view. But people do that in life as well. And so, like attracts like. McAllister is a place that tends to attract disproportionately students who are progressive, which is fine. I tell people all the time who complain about it, I cannot genetically engineer the political inclinations of a student body. But I really do believe that you become smarter if you interact with smart people who don't agree with you. It's not necessarily going to change your fundamental beliefs. Maybe it'll make those beliefs more intense, but they'll be wiser because they've come up against beliefs that are different. So I do wish, and we're not unique in this way, college campuses do tend to segment themselves. Students choose to go to school where they feel comfortable. But I do wish we had a little bit more space for views that were not part of the orthodoxy. And in that sense, McAllister is just a reflection of the larger society that we live in.
I, for a living, get paid to run digital ads for Democratic and progressive candidates.
Wonderful.
And so this feels like a real target on my back.
Political ads, man.
Yeah, target. Twitter's really making this fun for me right now. The serious part of this is that I tend to think that Twitter's decision to ban all of political ads is pretty anti-democratic.
Correct.
I think that Facebook's throw up our hands and say that Trump can lie about anything he wants is a huge abdication of their roles and responsibilities and the leadership that they should have to our society. Kofi, I think you said that, watching those Senate hearings with Zuckerberg is horrifying, right? There's a bunch of 90-year-olds asking questions about the interwebs. My question for you then is, if you were there, right? Amy Klobuchar becomes president. You're the next senator from Minnesota.
Perfect.
What do you ask, and what do you do as regulators to impact a better digital experience for political advertisers?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what do I ask, I think that's it's easy for us watching the thing to mock the people that are there. But I think the first one is actually figuring out. There's actually loads of people out there that are trying to do this work already. So for me, it's more about how do you build the coalition of the people that understand the space intimately, the Tristan Harrises of the world, Sense of Humane Technology, the work that's happening at Media, which is focusing exactly on this issue. There's a bunch of really smart people wrestling with these issues. So I think the thing you do differently is you don't assume that the 80-year-old senator from Vermont is the person who should be asking these questions. How does it become a private-public sort of partnership to actually address these issues in the right way, but also hold these companies to account, because until you do, like, nothing changes. So that's how I would think about the conversation sort of on the Hill in terms of like what the right policies are. I think you're exactly right. I think both of those things are like blunt instruments. To your point earlier, the right policy is like, what's the actual regulation? Like, banning them outright doesn't make sense for a whole variety of reasons. So what's the right? How do we start to think about what's allowed, what's not, who you're allowed to target, who you're not, what issues are allowed to be spoken about, what are not, and that becomes like, but it's not easy. All of this is nuanced.
All right, well, again, thank you to Andrew and to Kofi.